Your Fascism. In 1942, when I was 10, I won the first prize at the Ludi Juveniles, a compulsory open competition for all young Italian fascists, that is to say, for all young Italians. I had written a virtuoso piece of rhetoric in response to the essay titled "Should We Die for the Glory of Mussolini and the Immortal Destiny of Italy?" My answer was in the affirmative. I was a smart kid. Then in 1943 I discovered the meaning of the word freedom. I shall tell that story at the end of this speech. At the time, freedom did not yet mean liberation. I spent 2 of my earliest years surrounded by SS, fascists, and resistance fighters all busily shooting at one another, and I learned how to dodge bullets. It wasn't bad training. In April 1945 the partisans took Milan. 2 days later they arrived in the little town where I lived. It was a joyous moment. The main square was crowded with people singing and waving flags, calling loudly for Mimo, the leader of the local resistance movement. A former sergeant in the Carabinieri, Mimo had thrown his lot in with the followers of Badoglio and had lost a leg in one of the first clashes. He appeared on the balcony of the town hall, pale, with one hand. He tried to calm the crowd. I was waiting for him to begin his speech, given that my entire early childhood had been marked by Mussolini's great historic speeches, the most important parts of which we used to memorize at school. Silence. Mimo's voice was hoarse, you could hardly hear him. He said, "Citizens, friends. After so many painful sacrifices, here we are. Glory to those who fell for freedom." That was it. He went back inside. The crowd gave a shout, the partisans raised their weapons and fired into the air in festive mood. We kids rushed to collect the shell cases, precious collector's items, but I had also learned that freedom of speech means freedom from rhetoric. Some days later I saw the first American soldiers. They were African Americans. The first Yankee I met was a black man, Joseph, who introduced me to the wonders of Dick Tracy and Lil Abner. His comics were in color and smelled good. One of the officers, a Major or Captain Muddy, was billeted in a villa owned by the family of 2 of my classmates. It was a home away from home for me in that garden where some ladies were clustered around Captain Muddy, talking in sketchy French. Captain Muddy was a well-educated man and knew a little French. So my first image of the American liberators, after all those pale faces in black shirts, was that of a cultivated black man in a yellow-green uniform saying, "Oui, merci beaucoup, madame, moi aussi j'aime le champagne." Unfortunately there was no champagne, but Captain Muddy gave me my first chewing gum and I chewed it all day long. At night I would put the gum in a glass of water, to keep it fresh for the next day. In May we heard that the war was over. Peace gave me a curious feeling. I had been told that permanent war was the normal condition for a young Italian. Over the following months I discovered that the resistance was not a local phenomenon but a European one. I learned exciting new words like Réseau, Maquis, Armée Secrète, Rote Kapelle, and Warsaw Ghetto. I saw the first photographs of the Holocaust, and I learned what this meant even before I learned the word. I realized what it was we had been liberated from. Some people in Italy today wonder if the resistance had any real military impact on the course of the war. For my generation the question is irrelevant. We immediately understood the moral and psychological significance of the resistance. It was a source of pride to know that we Europeans had not waited for liberation passively. I think that for the young Americans who were paying their tribute of blood for our freedom it was not useless to know that behind the lines there were Europeans who were already paying their debt. Some Italians now say that the legend of the resistance is a communist lie. True, the communists did exploit the resistance as if it were their own private property, given that they played a primary role in it, but I recall partisans who wore kerchiefs of different colors. Glued to the radio, I would pass the nights, with the windows closed. The blackout made the tiny space around the radio the only halo of light, listening to the messages that Radio London broadcast to the partisans. They were at once cryptic and poetic: "The sun also rises, the roses will bloom," and most of them were messages for Franchi. Someone whispered to me once that Franchi was the leader of one of the most powerful clandestine groups in North Italy, a man of legendary courage. Franchi became my hero. Franchi, whose real name was Edgardo Sogno, was a monarchist. Such a fervent anti-communist that after the war he joined an extreme right-wing group and was accused of having collaborated in a reactionary coup. But what does it matter? Sogno is still the dream of my childhood. FN1 The liberation was a common undertaking achieved by people of different colors. Today in Italy some people say that the War of Liberation was a tragic period of division, and that now we need national reconciliation. The memory of those terrible years ought to be repressed. But repression causes neurosis. While reconciliation means compassion and respect for all those who fought the war in good faith, Forgiving does not mean forgetting. I can even admit that Eichmann believes sincerely in his mission, but I do not feel like saying, okay, go back and do it again. We are here to remember what happened and to declare solemnly that they must never do it again. But who are they? If we think again of the totalitarian governments that dominated Europe before the Second World War, we can easily say that they are unlikely to return in the same form in different historic circumstances. Mussolini's fascism was based on the idea of a charismatic leader, on corporativism, on the utopia of the fateful destiny of Rome, on the imperialistic will to conquer new lands, on inflammatory nationalism, on the ideal of an entirely regimented nation of black shirts, on the rejection of parliamentary democracy, and on anti-Semitism. I admit that Alleanza Nazionale, which sprang from the Movimento Sociale Italiano, is certainly a right-wing party, but it has little to do with the old fascism. Similarly, even though I am worried by the various pro-Nazi movements active here and there in Europe, Russia included, I don't think that Nazism, in its original form, is about to reappear as a movement involving an entire nation. Nonetheless, even though political regimes can be overturned, and ideologies criticized and delegitimized, behind a regime and its ideology there is always a way of thinking and feeling, a series of cultural habits, a nebula of obscure instincts and unfathomable drives. Is there then another ghost wandering through Europe, not to mention other parts of the world? Ionesco once said that only words count and all the rest is idle chatter. Linguistic habits are often important symptoms of unspoken sentiments. Allow me therefore to ask why not only the resistance but the entire Second World War has been defined all over the world as a struggle against fascism. If you reread Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, you will discover that Robert Jordan identifies his enemies with the fascists even when he is thinking of the Spanish phalangists. I yield the floor to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The victory of the American people and their allies will be a victory against fascism and the blind alley of despotism that it represents. September 23, 1944. During the McCarthy period, Americans who had taken part in the Spanish Civil War were called premature anti-fascists. Another way of saying that fighting Hitler in the 40s was a moral duty for all good Americans, but fighting against Franco too soon, in the 30s, was suspect. Why was an expression like fascist pig used by American radicals even to indicate a policeman who did not approve of what they smoked? Why didn't they say, Kogolard pig, phalangist pig, Ustasha pig, Quisling pig, anti-Pavelic pig, or Nazi pig? Mein Kampf is the complete manifesto of a political program. Nazism had a theory of race and Aryanism, a precise notion of entartete Kunst, degenerate art, a philosophy of the will to power and of the Übermensch. Nazism was decidedly anti-Christian and neo-pagan, just as Stalin's Diamat, the official version of Soviet Marxism, was clearly materialistic and atheist. If by totalitarian we mean a regime that subordinates all individual acts to the state and its ideology, then Nazism and Stalinism were totalitarian regimes. Fascism was certainly a dictatorship, but it was not wholly totalitarian, not so much for its moderation as for the philosophical weakness of its ideology. Contrary to commonly held belief, Italian fascism did not have a philosophy of its own. The article on fascism signed by Mussolini for the Encyclopedia Treccani was written or fundamentally inspired by Giovanni Gentile, but it reflected a late Hegelian notion of the ethical and absolute state that Mussolini never completely realized. Mussolini had no philosophy, all he had was rhetoric. He started out as a militant atheist, only to sign the Concordat with the church and to consort with the bishops who blessed the fascist banners. In his early anti-clerical years, according to a plausible story, he once asked God to strike him dead on the spot, to prove his existence. God evidently had other fish to fry at the time. In subsequent years, Mussolini always mentioned God in his speeches and was not above having himself called the man of Providence. It can be said that Italian fascism was the first right-wing dictatorship to dominate a European country, and that all similar movements later found a sort of common archetype in Mussolini's regime. Italian fascism was the first to create a military liturgy, a folklore, and even a style of dress, which enjoyed greater success abroad than Armani, Benetton, or Versace today. It was not until the 30s that fascist movements sprang up in England, with Mosley, and in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Yugoslavia, Spain, Portugal, Norway, and even South America, not to mention Germany. It was Italian fascism that convinced many European liberal leaders that the new regime was implementing interesting social reforms capable of providing a moderately revolutionary alternative to the communist threat. However, this historical precedence does not strike me as sufficient to explain why the word fascism has become a synecdoche, a denomination pars pro toto for different totalitarian movements. It is pointless to say that fascism contained in itself all the elements of successive totalitarian movements, so to speak, in a quintessential state. On the contrary, fascism contained no quintessence, and not even a single essence. It was a fuzzy form of totalitarianism. It was not a monolithic ideology, but rather a collage of diverse political and philosophical ideas, a tangle of contradictions. Is it possible to conceive of a totalitarian movement that manages to reconcile monarchy and revolution, the royal army and Mussolini's private militia, the privileges granted the church and a state education system that extolled violence, total control, and a free market? The Fascist Party came into being proclaiming a new revolutionary order, but it was financed by the most conservative landowners, who were expecting a counter-revolution. The Republican fascism of the early days endured for 20 years, proclaiming its loyalty to the royal family, allowing a duce to soldier on arm in arm with a king to whom he also offered the title of emperor. But when in 1943 the king sacked Mussolini, the party resurfaced 2 months later, with the help of the Germans, under the flag of a social republic, thus recycling its old revolutionary score, enhanced by a quasi-Jacobin streak. There was only one Nazi architecture, and one Nazi art. If the architect of the Nazis was Albert Speer, there was no room for Mies van der Rohe. In the same way, under Stalin, if Lamarck was right, there was no room for Darwin. In contrast, there certainly were fascist architects, but alongside their pseudo-colosseums there also rose new buildings inspired by the modern rationalism of Gropius. The fascists had no jardin neuf. In Italy there were 2 important art prizes. The Premio Cremona was controlled by an uncultivated and fanatical fascist like Farinacci, who encouraged propagandistic art. I can remember pictures with titles like Listening to the Duce's Speech on the Radio and Metal States created by fascism, and the Premio Bergamo, sponsored by a cultivated and reasonably tolerant fascist like Bottai, who protected art for art's sake, and the new avant-garde art that had been banned in Germany as corrupt and crypto-communist, contrary to Nibelungian kitsch, the only art allowed. The Italian national poet was D'Annunzio, a fop who in Germany or Russia would have found himself in front of a firing squad. He was elevated to the rank of bard to the regime for his nationalism and cult of heroism, with the addition of a strong dash of French decadence. Let's take Futurism. It ought to have been considered an example of Entartete Kunst, like Expressionism, Cubism, and Surrealism. But the first Italian futurists were nationalists. For aesthetic reasons they backed Italy's entry into the First World War, they celebrated speed, violence, and risk, and in a certain way these aspects seemed close to the fascist cult of youth. When fascism identified itself with ancient Rome and rediscovered rural traditions, Marinetti, who said an automobile was more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace, and even wanted to do away with moonlight, was named a member of the Accademia d'Italia, a body that treated moonlight with great respect. Many of the future partisans and intellectuals of the Communist Party were educated by the GUF, the Fascist Association of University Students, which was intended to be the cradle of a new fascist culture. These clubs became a sort of intellectual melting pot in which new ideas circulated without any real ideological control, not so much because party officials were tolerant, but because few of them possessed the intellectual equipment required to keep a check on the clubs. In the course of those 2 decades, the poetry of the so-called Hermetic School represented a reaction to the pompous style of the regime. These poets were allowed to elaborate their literary protest from inside the ivory tower. The sentiments of the Hermetic poets were exactly the opposite of the fascist cult of optimism and heroism. The regime tolerated this overt, albeit socially imperceptible dissent, because it did not pay sufficient attention to such obscure jargon. Which does not mean that Italian fascism was tolerant. Gramsci remained in prison until his death, Mattiatti and the Rosselli brothers were murdered, the free press suppressed, the labor unions dismantled, and political dissidents confined to remote islands. Legislative power became a mere sham, and the executive branch of government, which controlled the judiciary, and the mass media too, enacted new laws directly. This body of new law included the race laws, Italy's formal endorsement of the Holocaust. The inconsistent image I have described here was not due to tolerance, it was an example of political and ideological chaos. But it was orderly chaos, organized confusion. Fascism was philosophically unsound, but on an emotional level it was firmly anchored to certain archetypes. We have now come to the second part of my case. There was only one Nazism, and we cannot describe the ultra-Catholic Falangism of Franco as Nazism, given that Nazism is fundamentally pagan, polytheistic, and anti-Christian, otherwise it is not Nazism. On the other hand, You can play the fascism game many ways, and the name of the game does not change. According to Wittgenstein, what happens with the notion of fascism is what happens with the notion of play. A game can be competitive or otherwise, it can involve one or more people, it may require some particular skills or none, there may be money at stake or not. Games are a series of diverse activities that reveal only a few family resemblances. Let us suppose that there is a series of political groups. Group 1 is characterized by the aspects ABC, Group 2 by BCD, and so on. 2 is similar to 1 insofar as they have two aspects in common. 3 is similar to 2 and 4 is similar to 3 for the same reason. Note that 3 is also similar to 1, they share the aspect C. The most curious case is that of 4, obviously similar to 3 and 2 but without any characteristic in common with 1. Nevertheless, because of the uninterrupted series of decreasing similarities between 1 and 4, there remains, by virtue of a sort of illusory transitiveness, a sense of kinship between 4 and 1. The term fascism fits everything because it is possible to eliminate one or more aspects from a fascist regime and it will always be recognizably fascist. Remove the imperialist dimension from fascism, and you get Franco or Salazar. Remove the colonialist dimension, and you get Balkan fascism. Add to Italian fascism a dash of radical anti-capitalism, which never appealed to Mussolini, and you get Ezra Pound. Add the cult of Celtic mythology and the mysticism of the Grail, completely extraneous to official fascism, and you get one of the most respected gurus of fascism, Julius Evola. Despite this confusion, I think it is possible to draw up a list of characteristics typical of what I should like to call your fascism, or eternal fascism. These characteristics cannot be regimented into a system, many are mutually exclusive and are typical of other forms of despotism or fanaticism. But all you need is one of them to be present, and a fascist nebula will begin to coagulate. The first characteristic of your fascism is the cult of tradition. Traditionalism is older than fascism. It was not only typical of Catholic counter-revolutionary thinking after the French Revolution but was born in the late Hellenic period as a reaction to classical Greek rationalism. In the Mediterranean basin, the peoples of different religions, all indulgently welcomed into the Roman pantheon, began dreaming of a revelation received at the dawn of human history. This revelation lay for a long time concealed under a veil of languages by now forgotten. It was guarded by Egyptian hieroglyphics, Celtic runes, and the sacred writings, still unknown, of the Asiatic religions. This new culture was to be syncretic. Syncretism is not merely, as the dictionaries say, the combination of different forms of beliefs or practices. A combination like this must tolerate contradictions. All the original messages contain a grain of wisdom, and when they seem to be saying different or incompatible things, it is only because they all allude, allegorically, to some original truth. Consequently, there can be no advancement of learning. The truth has already been announced once and for all, and all we can do is continue interpreting its obscure message. It suffices to take a look at the syllabus of every fascist movement, and you will find the principal traditionalist thinkers. Nazi gnosis fed on traditionalist, syncretic, and occult elements. The most important theorist of the new Italian right, Julius Evola, mixed the Grail with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and alchemy with the Holy Roman Empire. The very fact that, in order to demonstrate its open-minded stance, a part of the Italian right has recently widened its syllabus by putting together de Maistre, Gounod, and Gramsci is glaring evidence of syncretism. If you browse through the New Age sections in American bookshops, you will even find St. Augustine, who, as far as I know, was not a fascist. But putting together St. Augustine and Stonehenge, now that is a symptom of your fascism. Traditionalism implies the rejection of modernism. Both the fascists and the Nazis worship technology, while traditionalist thinkers usually reject technology as the negation of traditional spiritual values. Nevertheless, although Nazism was proud of its industrial successes, its praise of modernity was only the superficial aspect of an ideology based on blood and soil, Blut und Boden. The rejection of the modern world was disguised as a condemnation of the capitalist way of life, but mainly concerned a rejection of the spirit of 1789, or of 1776, obviously. The Enlightenment and the Age of Reason were seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, your fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Irrationalism also depends on the cult of action for action's sake. Action is beautiful in itself, and therefore must be implemented before any form of reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. Therefore culture is suspect insofar as it is identified with critical attitudes. From the statement attributed to Goebbels, "When I hear talk of culture, I take out my pistol, To the frequent use of expressions like goddamn intellectuals, eggheads, radical snobs, the universities are a den of communists, suspicion of intellectual life has always been a symptom of your fascism. The official fascist intellectuals were mainly committed to accusing modern culture and the liberal intelligentsia of having abandoned traditional values. No form of syncretism can accept criticism. The critical spirit makes distinctions, and distinguishing is a sign of modernity. In modern culture, the scientific community sees dissent as a tool with which to promote the advancement of learning. For your fascism, dissent is betrayal. Dissent is moreover a sign of diversity. Your fascism grows and seeks a consensus by exploiting and exacerbating the natural fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is a call against intruders. Your fascism is therefore racist by definition. Your fascism springs from individual or social frustration, which explains why one of the characteristics typical of historic fascist movements was the appeal to the frustrated middle classes, disquieted by some economic crisis or political humiliation, and frightened by social pressure from below. In our day, in which the old proletarians are becoming petit bourgeois, and the lumpen proletariat has excluded itself from the political arena, fascism will find its audience in this new majority. To those with no social identity at all, your fascism says that their only privilege is the most common privilege of all, that of being born in the same country. This is the origin of nationalism. Moreover, the only ones who can provide the nation with an identity are the enemy. Thus, at the root of your fascist psychology lies the obsession with conspiracies, preferably international ones. The disciples must feel that they are under siege. The easiest way to construct a conspiracy is to appeal to xenophobia. But conspiracies must also come from the inside. The Jews are usually the best target, because they offer the advantage of being at once both inside and outside. In America, the latest example of this obsession with conspiracies is Pat Robertson's book The New World Order. The disciples must feel humiliated by the enemy's vaunted wealth and power. When I was a little boy, they taught me that the English were the 5 meals people, eating more often than the poor but sober Italians. The Jews are wealthy and help one another through a secret network of mutual assistance. But the disciples must nonetheless feel they can defeat the enemy. Thus, thanks to a continual shifting of the rhetorical register, the enemy is at once too strong and too weak. Fascist regimes are doomed to lose their wars, because they are constitutionally incapable of making an objective assessment of the enemy's strength. For your fascism there is no struggle for life but, rather, a life for struggle. Pacifism is therefore collusion with the enemy. Pacifism is bad, because life is a permanent war. This, however, brings with it an Armageddon complex. Since the enemy can and must be defeated, there must be a last battle, after which the movement will rule the world. Such a final solution implies a subsequent era of peace, a golden age that contradicts the principle of permanent war. No fascist leader has ever managed to resolve this contradiction. Elitism is a typical aspect of all reactionary ideologies, insofar as it is basically aristocratic. In the course of history, all forms of aristocratic and militaristic elitism have implied scorn for the weak. Your fascism cannot do without preaching a popular elitism. Every individual belongs to the best people in the world, party members are the best citizens, and every citizen can, or ought to, become a party member. But you cannot have patricians without plebeians. The leader, who is well aware that his power has not been obtained by delegation but was taken by force, also knows that his power is based on the weakness of the masses, who are so weak as to need and deserve a dominator. Since the group is organized hierarchically, along military lines, each subordinate leader looks down on his inferiors, and each of his inferiors looks down in turn on his own underlings. All this looking down reinforces the sense of a mass elite. From this point of view, everyone is trained to become a hero. In every mythology the hero is an exceptional being, but in the your fascist ideology heroism is the norm. This cult of heroism is closely connected to the cult of death. There is nothing accidental about the fact that the motto of the Phalangists was Viva la muerte. Normal people are told that death is unpleasant but has to be faced with dignity. Believers are told that it is a painful way to attain a supernatural happiness. But the your fascist hero aspires to death, hailed as the finest reward for a heroic life. The your fascist hero is impatient to die. In his impatience, it should be noted, he usually manages to make others die in his place. Since both permanent war and heroism are difficult games to play, the your fascist transfers his will to power onto sexual questions. This is the origin of machismo, which implies contempt for women and an intolerant condemnation of nonconformist sexual habits. from chastity to homosexuality. Since sex is also a difficult game to play, your fascist hero plays with weapons, which are his ersatz penis. His war games are due to a permanent state of penis envy. Your fascism is based on qualitative populism. In a democracy, the citizens enjoy individual rights, but as a whole the citizens have a political impact only from a quantitative point of view. The decisions of the majority are followed. For your fascists, individuals have no rights, and the people is conceived of as a monolithic entity that expresses the common will. Since no quantity of human beings can possess a common will, the leader claims to be their interpreter. Having lost their power to delegate, the citizens do not act, they are only called upon, pars pro toto, to play their role as the people. The people is thus merely a theatrical pretense. For a good example of qualitative populism, we no longer need Piazza Venezia or the stadium in Nuremberg. In our future there looms qualitative TV or internet populism, in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. As a result of its qualitative populism, your fascism has to oppose rotten parliamentary governments. One of the first things Mussolini said in the Italian parliament was, "I could have transformed this grey and sordid chamber into a bivouac for my soldiers." As a matter of fact, he immediately found a better billet for his soldiery, but shortly after that he dissolved the parliament. Every time a politician casts doubt on the legitimacy of a parliament because it no longer represents the voice of the people, there is a suspicion of your fascism. Your fascism uses newspeak. Newspeak was invented by Orwell in 1984, as the official language of INGSOC, the English Socialist Movement, but elements of your fascism are common to different forms of dictatorship. All the Nazi and fascist scholastic texts were based on poor vocabulary and elementary syntax, the aim being to limit the instruments available to complex and critical reasoning. But we must be prepared to identify other types of newspeak, even when they take the innocent form of a popular talk show. Now that I have listed the possible characteristics of your fascism, let me come to a conclusion. On the morning of July 27, 1943, I learned from a radio news broadcast that fascism had collapsed and Mussolini had been arrested. My mother sent me to buy a newspaper. I went to the nearest newsstand and saw that there were newspapers, but the names were different. Moreover, after a quick glance at the headlines, I realized that every newspaper said something different. I bought one at random and read the message printed on the front page, signed by 5 or 6 political parties, like Democrazia Cristiana, Partito Comunista, Partito Socialista, Partito d'Azione, and Partito Liberale. Until that moment I had believed that there was only one party in every country, and that in Italy there was only the National Fascist Party. I was discovering that in my country there could be many different parties at the same time. What's more, since I was a smart kid, I realized right away that all those parties could not have emerged overnight. Thus I understood that they had already existed as clandestine organizations. The message celebrated the end of the dictatorship and the return of freedom of speech, of the press, of political association. My God, I had never read words like freedom or dictatorship in all my life. By virtue of these words I was reborn as a free Western man. We must make sure that the sense of these words is not forgotten again. Your fascism is still around us, sometimes in civilian clothes. It would be so easy for us if someone would look out onto the world stage and say, "I want to reopen Auschwitz, I want the black shirts to march through the streets of Italy once more." Alas, life is not so simple. Your fascism can still return in the most innocent of guises. Our duty is to unmask it and to point the finger at each of its new forms, every day, in every part of the world. Once more I yield the floor to Roosevelt. I dare to say that if American democracy ceased to progress as a living force, seeking night and day by peaceful means to improve the condition of our citizens, the power of fascism would grow in our country. November 4, 1938. Freedom and liberation are never-ending tasks. Let this be our motto, do not forget. And now I should like to close with a poem by Franco Fortini. On the parapet of the bridge. The heads of hanged men. In the water of the fountain. The drool of hanged men. On the cobbles of the market. The fingernails of men shot down. On the dry grass of the meadow. The teeth of men shot down. Bite the air, bite the stones. Our flesh is the flesh of men no more. Bite the air, bite the stones. Our hearts are the hearts of men no more. But we have read the dead men's eyes. And the world's freedom is the gift we bring. While the coming justice is close. Clenched in the hands of the dead. Translated by Alistair McEwen. Censorship and silence. Those of you who are younger may think that Velina are pretty girls who dance about on television shows, and that a casino is a chaotic mess. Anyone of my generation knows that the word casino used to mean brothel, and only later, by connotation, did it come to mean somewhere chaotic, so that it lost its initial meaning, and today anyone, perhaps even a bishop, uses it to indicate disorder. Likewise, once upon a time a bordello was a brothel, but my grandmother, a woman of the most upright morals, used to say, "Don't make a bordello," meaning don't make too much racket. The word had completely lost its original meaning. The younger ones among you may not know that, during the fascist regime, veline were sheets of paper that the government department responsible for controlling culture, called the Ministry of Popular Culture, shortened to Minculpop. They didn't have sufficient sense of humor to avoid such an ambiguous-sounding name, sent to the newspapers. These sheets of thin copy paper told the newspapers what they had to keep quiet about and what they had to print. The velina, in journalistic jargon, therefore came to symbolize censorship, the inducement to conceal, to make information disappear. FN2. The veline that we know today, the television showgirls, are, however, the exact opposite. They are, as we all know, the celebration of outward appearance, visibility, indeed of fame achieved through pure visibility, where appearance signifies excellence, even that kind of appearance that would once have been considered unseemly. We find ourselves with two forms of velina, which I would like to compare with two forms of censorship. The first is censorship through silence, the second is censorship through noise. I use the word velina, therefore, as a symbol of the television event, the show, entertainment, news coverage, and so on. Fascism had understood, as dictators generally do, that deviant behavior is encouraged by the fact that the media give it coverage. For example, the veline used to say don't write about suicide because the mere mention of suicide might inspire someone to commit suicide a few days later. This is absolutely correct. We shouldn't assume all that went through the minds of the fascist hierarchy was wrong, and it is quite true that we know about events of national significance that have occurred only because the media have talked about them. For example, the student protests of 1977 and 1989. They were short-lived events that sought to repeat the protests of 1968 only because the newspapers had begun saying 1968 is about to return. Anyone involved in those events knows perfectly well that they were created by the press, in the same way that the press generates revenge attacks, suicides, classroom shootings, news about one school shooting provokes other school shootings, and a great many Romanians have probably been encouraged to rape old ladies because the newspapers told them it is the exclusive speciality of immigrants and is extremely easy to commit. All you have to do is loiter in any pedestrian passage, near a railway station, and so forth. If the old-style velina used to say, to avoid causing behavior considered to be deviant, don't talk about it, the velina culture of today says, to avoid talking about deviant behavior, talk a great deal about other things. I have always taken the view that if, by some chance, I discovered that tomorrow's newspapers were going to take up some wrong I had committed that would cause me serious harm, the first thing I'd do would be plant a bomb outside the local police headquarters or railway station. The next day the newspaper front pages would be full of it and my personal misdemeanor would end up as a small inside story. And who knows how many real bombs have been planted to make other front page stories disappear. The example of the bomb is sonically appropriate, as it is an example of a great noise that silences everything else. Noise becomes a cover. I would say that the ideology of the censorship through noise can be expressed, with apologies to Wittgenstein, by saying, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must talk a great deal. The flagship TG1 news program on Italian state television, for example, is a master of this technique, full of news items about calves born with two heads and bags snatched by petty thieves. In other words, the sort of minor stories papers used to put low on an inside page, which now serve to fill up 3/4 of an hour of information, to ensure we don't notice other news stories they ought to have covered have not been covered. Several months ago, the press controlled by Berlusconi, in order to undermine the authority of a magistrate who criticized the premier, followed him for days, reporting that he sat smoking on a bench, went to the barber, and wore turquoise socks. To make a noise, you don't have to invent stories. All you have to do is report a story that is real but irrelevant, yet creates a hint of suspicion by the simple fact that it has been reported. It is true and irrelevant that the magistrate wears turquoise socks, but the fact it has been reported creates a suggestion of something not quite confessed, leaving a mark, an impression. Nothing is more difficult to dispose of than an irrelevant but true story. The error made by La Repubblica in its campaign against Berlusconi was to give too much coverage to a relevant story, the party at Noemi's house. FN3 if, instead, It had reported something like this: Berlusconi went into Piazza Navona yesterday morning, met his cousin, and they had a beer together. How curious! It would have triggered such a series of insinuations, suspicions, and embarrassments that the premier would have resigned long ago. In short, a fact that is too relevant can be challenged, whereas an accusation that is not an accusation cannot be challenged. At the age of 10 I was stopped in the doorway of a bar by a lady who said, "I'll give you £1 if you write a letter for me, I've hurt my hand." Being a decent child I replied that I didn't want any money and would do it simply as a favor, but the lady insisted on buying me an ice cream. I wrote the letter for her and explained what had happened when I got home. "Good Lord," said my mother, "they've made you write an anonymous letter. Heaven knows what will happen to us when they find out." "Look," I explained, "there is nothing terrible in that letter. In fact, it was addressed to a wealthy businessman, whom I also knew. He had a shop in the city center. And it said, 'It has come to our attention that you intend to ask for the hand of Signorina X in marriage. We wish to inform you that Signorina X is from a respectable and prosperous family and is highly regarded throughout the city.'" Now, you don't usually see an anonymous letter that praises the subject of the letter rather than damning her. But what was the purpose of that anonymous letter? Since the lady who recruited me clearly had no grounds for saying anything else, she wanted at least to create unease. The recipient would have wondered, why should they send me such a letter? What does highly regarded throughout the city actually mean? I believe the wealthy businessman would have decided in the end to postpone the idea of marriage for fear of setting up home with someone so gossiped about. This form of noise doesn't even require that the transmitted messages be of any particular interest, since one message adds to another, and together they create noise. Noise can sometimes take the form of superfluous excess. A few months ago there was a fine article by Berselli in L'Espresso magazine, saying, "Do you realize that advertising no longer has any effect on us? No one can prove that one soap powder is better than another, in fact they are all the same. So for the past 50 years the only method anyone has come up with shows us housewives who refuse the offer of 2 packets in exchange for their own brand, or grandmothers who tell us that this recalcitrant stain will disappear if we use the right powder. Soap companies therefore carry out an intensive and relentless campaign, consisting of the same message, which everyone knows by heart, so that it becomes proverbial, Omo washes whiter than white, and so on. Its purpose is twofold, partly to repeat the brand name. In certain cases it becomes a successful strategy. If I have to go into a supermarket and ask for soap powder, I will ask for Tide or Omo because I have known these names for the past 50 years, and partly to prevent anyone from realizing that no epideictic discussion can be made about soap powder, either for or against. And the same happens with other forms of advertising. Berselli observes that in every mobile phone advert, none of us actually understand what the characters are saying. But there's no need to understand what they say, it is the great noise that sells cell phones. I think it is most probable that companies have jointly agreed to stop promoting their own particular brands and to carry out general publicity, to spread the mobile telephone culture. If you buy Nokia instead of Samsung, you'll be persuaded by other factors, but not by advertising. In fact, the main function of the publicity noise is to remind you of the advertising sketch, not the product. Try to think of the most pleasant, the most enjoyable piece of advertising, some are even quite funny, and to remember which product it relates to. It is very rare that you manage to remember the name of the product to which that advertisement refers. The child who mispronounces Simmenthal, or perhaps no martini, no party or Ramad Saudi is always good for you. In all other cases the noise compensates for the fact that there is no way to demonstrate the excellence of the product. The Internet, of course, generates, with no intention to censor, the greatest noise that yields no information. Or rather, first, you receive information, but you don't know whether it is reliable. Second, you try searching for information on the Internet. Only we academics and researchers, after 10 minutes work, can begin to select the information we want. Most other users are stuck on blogs, or on a porn site, and so forth, without surfing too far, because surfing isn't going to help them find reliable information. Looking further at cases of noise that do not presuppose any intention to censure, but nevertheless tend toward censorship, we should also mention the newspaper with 64 pages. 64 pages are too many to give real prominence to the most essential information. Here again, some of you will say, but I buy a newspaper to find the news that interests me. Certainly, but those who do that are an elite who know how to deal with information, and there must be some good explanation for the frightening drop in the number of newspapers being sold and read. Young people no longer read newspapers. It is easier to find the La Repubblica or Corriere della Sera sites on the Internet. There, at least, it is all on one screen, or to read the free sheets at the train station, where the news is set out on 2 pages. Therefore, as a result of noise, we have a deliberate censorship. This is what is happening in the world of television, in creating political scandals, and so forth, and we have an involuntary but fatal censorship whereby, for reasons that are entirely legitimate in themselves, such as advertising revenue, product sales, and so forth, an excessive information is transformed into noise. This, and here I am moving from communications to ethics, has also created a psychology and morality of noise. Look at that idiot walking along the street, wearing his iPod headphones. He cannot spend an hour on the train reading a newspaper or looking at the countryside, but has to go straight to his mobile phone during the first part of the journey to say I've just left and on the second part of the journey to say I'm just arriving. There are people now who cannot live away from noise. And it is for this reason that restaurants, already noisy places, offer extra noise from a television screen, sometimes 2, and music, and if you ask for them to be switched off, people stare at you as if you're mad. This great need for noise is like a drug, it is a way to avoid focusing on what is really important. Ready in interior hominem, yes, in the end, the example of St. Augustine could still provide a good ideal for the world of politics and television. It is in silence alone that the only truly powerful means of information becomes effective, word of mouth. All people, even when they are oppressed by the most censorious tyrants, have been able to find out all that is going on in the world through popular word of mouth. Publishers know that books do not become bestsellers through publicity or reviews but by what the French call bouche à oreille and the Italians call passaparola. Books achieve success through word of mouth. In losing the condition of silence, we lose the possibility of hearing what other people are saying, which is the only basic and reliable means of communication. And that is why, in conclusion, I would say that one of the ethical problems we face today is how to return to silence. And one of the semiotic problems we might consider is the closer study of the function of silence in various aspects of communication. To examine a semiotics of silence, it may be a semiotics of reticence, a semiotics of silence in theater, a semiotics of silence in politics, a semiotics of silence in political debate, in other words, the long pause, silence as creation of suspense, silence as threat, silence as agreement, silence as denial, silence in music. Look how many subjects there are to study concerning the semiotics of silence. I invite you to consider, therefore, not words but silence. Translated by Richard Dixon. We are European. In 1678 and 1679, Nijmegen hosted delegates from dozens of European countries and city-states whose aim was to resolve a series of wars that had devastated our continent. The resulting treaties of Nijmegen ended a variety of interrelated wars that had raged until then between France, the Netherlands, Spain, Brandenburg, Sweden, Denmark, the Prince-Bishopric of Munster and the Holy Roman Empire. Even though the treaties were subsequently disregarded, this effort was, after the horrors of the 30 Years' War, the first example of an attempt to establish peace through dialogue and negotiations. This could therefore be seen as one of the first examples of European cooperation and accord and can be said to be a key event in European history. Over 250 years went by between those treaties and 1945, but we can say that the utopia born in Nijmegen came of age at the end of the Second World War. It is a source of constant congratulation for people of my generation, whereas our children and grandchildren find it obvious that today it is inconceivable, ridiculous, even, to think of a possible war between France and Germany, Italy and Great Britain, Spain and the Low Countries. Young people, if they are not history students, find it hard to comprehend that such conflicts have been the norm for the last 2,000 years. Sometimes even older people are not consciously aware of this, except perhaps when they feel a thrill on crossing European frontiers without a passport and without having to change money. But it's worth remembering that not only our distant ancestors but also our fathers were accustomed to crossing those same frontiers with guns in their hands. From 1945 onward, almost without realizing it, Europeans began to feel they belonged not only to the same continent but also to the same community, despite the many inevitable linguistic and cultural differences. I am not a naive idealist and I am well aware that if Europeans are no longer shooting at one another, there are nonetheless many forms of no less violent contention that often divide our countries. The current financial crisis, for example, is not producing a new sense of brotherhood so much as an atmosphere of mutual distrust. The sense of a European identity may neither look the same to nor seem obvious to all the citizens of the various nations, but at least among the more responsible citizens, and especially among the more cultured young people, for example, students on the Erasmus program who live together with their fellows from other countries and who often marry each another, thereupon raising a new, bilingual generation. The idea of being European is ever more widespread. Perhaps we do not feel European enough when we travel in Europe and are still disturbed by our neighbors' different customs, but a visit to another continent suffices to make us realize that, even if we like these distant countries, when we meet another European abroad we get the feeling that we are back home talking with someone we understand. Suddenly, we catch a whiff of something familiar, and so an Italian may feel more at ease with a Norwegian than with an American. There are countless reasons why a French person may think differently from a German, but both have been formed by a series of shared experiences, from wealth gained through disputes over work rather than an individualistic ethic of success, to the old pride and the subsequent failure of colonialism, not to mention the experience of dreadful dictatorships, and not only have we experienced those but by now we are also able to recognize the warning signs. We have been vaccinated by the many wars in our countries. Sometimes I think that if 2 airplanes had crashed into Notre Dame or Big Ben, we would certainly have been devastated, but without the feelings of inexplicable bewilderment, desperate incredulity and depression that struck Americans on being attacked by an enemy in their own country for the first time in their history. Our tragedies have made us wise and ruthless, better prepared to deal with horror. We seek peace because we have known too many wars. But we must be realistic and recognize that, despite all this, wars, hatred and intolerance persist within Europe's borders. We must be aware that new forms of conflict obsess us, even when we do not perceive them in all their magnitude and importance. Within our frontiers we are still involved in a, sometimes hidden, form of warfare with people who live in Europe but who we, or at least many of our fellow countrymen, continue to think of as non-EU nationals. The problem that now concerns a reconciled Europe, one which can optimistically celebrate the triumph of the spirit of the Nijmegen treaties, is the need to sign a new virtual treaty against intolerance. The struggle against our intolerance does not only regard so-called non-EU nationals. It is a form of illusion to consider the new cases of anti-Semitism as a marginal sickness that affects only a lunatic fringe. Recent episodes tell us that the specter of this obsession is still among us. Today in Nijmegen, as we celebrate that first dream of European peace, we must declare war on racism. If we are unable to defeat this eternal adversary we will always be at war, even if we have laid down our arms, for there are still many weapons in circulation, as was demonstrated by the massacre on the Norwegian island of Utøya or by the slaughter in the Jewish school in France. Nonetheless, the war on intolerance has its limits. Fighting against our own intolerance does not mean having to accept every worldview or make ethical relativism the new European religion. While we educate our fellow citizens and especially our children to open-minded tolerance, we should also recognize that there are customs, ideas and behaviors that are, and must remain, intolerable to us. Some values typical of the European worldview represent a heritage we must not relinquish. To decide on and recognize those things that, even within a tolerant worldview, remain intolerable is the kind of frontier that Europeans are called upon to draw up every day, with a sense of equity and the constant exercise of that virtue which, from Aristotle onwards, philosophers have called prudence. From a philosophical standpoint, prudence does not signify a reluctance to take risks, nor does it coincide with cowardice. In the classical meaning of phronesis, prudence is the ability to control and discipline oneself through the use of reason, and as such it has been considered one of the 4 cardinal virtues and is often associated with wisdom and intuition, the capacity to judge between good and bad actions, not only in a general sense, but with regard to opportune action at a given time and place. It must be possible, in our collective war on intolerance, to always distinguish between the tolerable and the intolerable. It must be possible to decide how to accept a new plurality of values and customs without giving up the best of our European heritage. I am not here today to propose solutions to the fundamental problem of a new European peace, but to affirm that only by facing the challenge of this ever-present war will we have a peaceful future. What we need to do now is sign a new Treaty of Nijmegen. Translated by Alistair.